It's now 1300 GMT. Europeans in Niger getting ready to be evacuated following a coup there. France plans to evacuate hundreds of French and European citizens from Niger over the next 24 hours. Its foreign ministry held a crisis meeting in Paris earlier to coordinate the operation. That follows attacks on the French embassy in the capital, Niamey, and the closure of Niger's borders after President Mohamed Bazoum was deposed last week. The leaders of neighbouring Burkina Faso and Mali have warned that any military intervention would be considered a declaration of war against them too. Victoria Gatenby reports.
They're working around the clock at the Foreign Ministry in Paris, diplomats preparing to evacuate French citizens from Niger after President Mohamed Bazoum was deposed last week. Niger is one of the world's poorest countries and relies heavily on financial support from Western backers and the regional bloc ECOWAS. Most of that aid has been frozen because of the coup. The military rulers in neighbouring Mali and Burkina Faso have criticised the funding freeze, saying the poorest will be hit hardest. French troops were ordered to leave Mali recently.
We refuse to apply these illegal, illegitimate and inhumane sanctions against the people of Niger. We warn that any military intervention against Niger will be considered as a declaration of war against Burkina Faso and Mali.
Before the coup, Niger was an important ally of the West in the fight against armed groups linked to Al-Qaeda in the Sahel. It's also one of the world's biggest producers of uranium, which fuels nuclear power stations. Niger produced more than 2,000 tons of high-grade uranium last year. That's 5% of global output. France is heavily reliant on nuclear energy. Niger supplies an estimated 15% of uranium for French nuclear power stations. The French government says that it has 2 years' worth of uranium stocks. Some analysts say Western powers are only interested in Niger's natural resources.
It's very worrisome, and I think all Africans must be very worried or concerned that France is making itself, or has made itself, a former colonial power, a kingmaker in Africa, and chooses to protect its interest, even if that means removing African leaders.
The leaders of the coup have announced the suspension of uranium exports to France and other European countries and are warning the West and ECOWAS not to order a military intervention. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera.
Well, just before coming on air, I spoke to Iro Sani via WhatsApp. He's the special advisor to the deposed President Mohamed Bazoum. Now, he says the coup leader's approach in Niger will lead to further violence.
A peaceful resolution of this conflict is all what everyone is hoping in this country, and nobody really wishes to see a bloodshed or really a violent conflict bursting in our country. But all depends on the junta, who seized the power by force and is holding in hostage our president, and is using violence to attack our people who are trying to demonstrate their disapprobation of what they are doing, and that who are showing that they don't agree with the coup. There's violence that's going on. Many of our political members are under arrest. This is the violence that they are using. So we wish that the violence may not burst into our country, but the behavior of the junta who seized the power is leading to violence in this country.
Ahmed Idris is following developments from Abuja in neighbouring Nigeria. Joins us from there now. So first of all, we heard reports, Ahmed, of borders being closed, airspace being closed. How is that impacting life? How is it impacting people there?
It's a tough one. There's been significant trade between Nigeria and Niger, for example. Trade between Niger and Chad, trade between Niger and Cameroon. When these borders were closed, it makes it more difficult for people. Take, for example, the Gibia crossing point, the Kongolam crossing points. These are two important crossing points. Trade between these two countries, on a daily basis, you find hundreds of traders from Niger crossing into Nigeria to buy supplies and cross over into the country. Similarly, there are goods coming in from Niger into Nigeria. All that now has stopped, and that is causing a lot of pain, not only to Nigerians who cannot access those goods on the Nigerian side, and of course, the Nigerians who couldn't sell their products across the border in Niger.
Ahmed, where do these closures leave European plans for evacuations?
Well, news out of Yemen a few hours ago before we came on air, some movements have been noticed. We were informed reliably that the Italians are almost ready. There are some cars heading to the airport. It's not clear whether they're entirely European, entirely Italians or a mixture of all Europeans heading to the airport. But what we know right now is that 4 flights have been scheduled, and they are all coming from the civilian wing of the airport. Remember, at the Niamey airport, there is a military wing where you have the Americans, the French, and the Belgians, all with their own units in that particular airport. So movement has started in that regard, and we understand that 4 flights have been organized already. These flights, if each of the aircraft can carry up to 400 people, then we're probably looking at almost all the foreigners wanting to leave before tomorrow.
And you've been watching the situation with ECOWAS. What impact are the warnings from Burkina Faso and Mali against military intervention having on ECOWAS? Has there been any reaction?
There's been no reaction, however, but I understand that there are also moves to try and push this to resolve this diplomatically. But again, the challenge, the movement or the statement from the Malian military person overnight is a direct challenge to the authority of ECOWAS. And that's what most analysts were talking about. They said the failure of the regional bloc to take action when the first coup was muted or announced in Mali was what encouraged coup in Guinea and Burkina Faso. And now we're having the same in Niger. And there are real concerns that they could spread unless ECOWAS prove its stance on coups in West Africa. It has the opportunity to do it now, but who is going to contribute the forces to tackle the Nigerian forces, and possibly if Mali and Burkina Faso want to intervene? So that's the big question now. And apart from that, we're also looking at the finances. Who is going to foot the bill to finance this military adventure in Niger?
All right, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much, Ahmed Idris. Well, Ben Godwin is Director of Analysis at PRISM, Political Risk Management. Joins us now from London. Good to have you with us. So if we could focus on one aspect, there's a lot of things to talk about, obviously, with Niger, but it is an important player when it comes to the supply of uranium in the global market. Has the coup in Niger put a question mark over that supply, particularly for Europe, particularly for France?
I think it's added to a lot of question marks around the uranium sector and uranium supply. So you might say Niger produces 4% of the world's supply. Okay, that's a problem, but it's not an enormous problem. But actually, it produces 15% of France's uranium. 70% of French energy is produced by nuclear power, and it produces 20% of the European Union's uranium. So it is certainly a topic of great interest at the moment, particularly as uranium markets are very, very tight at the moment. Demand has been going up over the last few years, and this year we've seen the uranium spot price go up by nearly 40% year to date.
So given what you've said, if prices are rising and if, as we know, Europe wants to move away from importing from another top supplier, Russia, does that mean Europe is really in a tough position to find an alternative to Niger uranium?
It is to a degree. We have to separate two things here. There's uranium, which is the raw material that creates nuclear fuel, and there's nuclear fuel itself. But what we see across the world is that the uranium and the nuclear fuel markets are bifurcating. So on the one hand, we have the West, which has a renewed interest in uranium and nuclear fuel because, as you've mentioned, the global energy transition. But we also see Russia and China looking to gain more market share in the uranium sector. China in particular has been ramping up its presence in places such as Niger Niger for the last 10 years or so, and that is only going to increase. China intends to build more than 100 nuclear reactors by the end of the decade, for example. In addition, we have the complication of the war in Ukraine and Western sanctions against Russia. So Russia produces about 30% of the world's nuclear fuel. It's a critical supplier to the European Union and to the United States. For that reason, the EU and the US hasn't put sanctions on Russia's nuclear energy sector. But Western utilities are not looking to buy more nuclear fuel from Russia for fear of sanctions and for fear of political backlash against it. So going back to the original point, Niger may be 4% of the world's uranium, but given the tensions and the bifurcation of the uranium and nuclear fuel market that we see around the world, it's actually quite a critical player now.
Does that have a knock-on effect then? And is it going to make Europe perhaps a lot slower or reluctant to impose more sanctions on Russian uranium than at this point?
Absolutely. So if you look at Western sanctions across the Russian economy, the Russian uranium sector, the state nuclear company Rosatom is one of the few exceptions to the waves of sanctions that the EU and the US has put on Russia. I think really the US and the EU are trying to ramp up their uranium enrichment and conversion, but that's going to take 2-3 years at least. And so for the time being, it's unlikely that you'll see Western sanctions against Russian nuclear fuel or nuclear fuel exports. But at the same time, you're seeing Western utilities very reluctant to buy those nuclear fuel exports in the first place. So there is an element of self-sanctioning, even if official sanctions are not in place.
All right, let's look at this from the other way around. How important is France and Europe for Niger's exports of uranium?
So Niger exports about 50% of its uranium to France and the wider European Union. So you could argue that it's obviously critical to Niger's uranium exports. But we know that there's tremendous interest from Russia and China in Niger as well. Both are heavily present. We've talked a lot over the last month or so about the Wagner paramilitary group from Russia. That group has a presence in Niger as well. So I think the question coming out of this coup is, are we going to go back to the status quo ante, where these supplies continue going into France and the wider European Union, or actually are the coup leaders going to look for new partners for the supply of uranium? I don't think it's the case that if Niger stops supplying to France, that uranium will go unsold. There will be other buyers for it.
All right, thanks so much for your analysis.
Thank you.